Amen. Good morning. A few weeks ago, it was a Sunday morning, and I wasn't preaching, so I was just I was here early in the morning. I was just kind of walking around. I was chatting with people as I usually do. And it was a strange morning because almost everyone I talked to, the conversation was just slightly different. It just seemed like, in general, people were just a little bit happier, a little bit chattier, a little bit more kind of willing to do whatever they had gotten to do. I mean, we had people come early to set up, easy ups and tents to get stuff together in our cafe and all that. And just everyone seemed to be in a really good mood. I myself didn't really feel very different, but that's because on daylight savings time, Emma doesn't care very much. It was November 3rd, right? And everywhere I went, everyone I talked to had gotten 1 extra hour of sleep. And you would think then that their entire demeanor had completely changed. Like their whole life was different because 1 extra hour of sleep meant that we all seemed to be in a better place together. 1 hour, that was it. 1 hour change. You probably know this, right? Like that's some people, that first Sunday in November is like their favorite day of the year. It's like free extra hour, right? Now, the converse is also true. I was doing some looking at some of our attendance. I noticed this pattern when I was looking for something else. The second Sunday in March, known as the beginning of daylight savings time, the bad daylight savings time, that one. If you compare the attendance statistics between that Sunday and the Sunday on either side of it, there is a 16% drop in attendance over the last 2 years. That's a Rose Drive stat. I don't know about the rest of the country, but at least here, 16% drop in attendance. I mean, that's where we're at with that, right? So it could go the other way, too. I actually read once that heart attacks increased by 10% on the bad daylight savings time day. Like, I don't know if the inverse is true. On the good day, do heart attacks go down? I couldn't tell you. All I know is on the good day, we're all happy. And the only difference, as far as I know, is that we all got an extra hour of sleep. It's the smallest little change in human behavior that has the biggest impact on how we all relate to each other, which leads me to ask this question. If 1 hour of sleep can make that much difference in our lives, what would it look like if our lives were actually fully transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit? I think we would see a difference. You're catching us at the very end of a series in Galatians that we're calling Living Free. And in a moment, I'm going to kind of catch us up on what we've been doing in this series because this entire book has been getting us to a certain point. And so we have to follow the entire train of what Paul is trying to communicate in order to get to this place now. And so to do that, I will review kind of anything that you might have missed in this series in just a little bit. But before we do that, I want to look at some key verses for this morning. We're going to keep coming back to these verses over and over again because I think they're so fascinating and so important for how we understand the Christian life. And so this is Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. It says this, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." And I want to focus in on this line here. Let us not become weary in doing good. That's the start of verse 9. And when I read this, I'm conflicted. There's two things that happen to me at once. One is this. Okay, so back early in the fall, I mentioned this before. Barna came out with this study that said that kind of globally around the world, when people are asking themselves about Christianity, the question, is Christianity true, has kind of fallen to a secondary priority. The first thing people want to know is Christianity good? They're not actually fully convinced it's good yet. So they don't really care if it's true until they know if it's good. That's just sort of where our culture is at right now. But I look at this verse, let us not become weary in doing good, and I want to say, yes, the answer is obvious. It's there. This is what we're here to do. We're here to do good. This is something that we're called to by God. But at the same time, I get a little bit hung up by another word in this little section. Let's not become weary. And that one's harder for me. It's harder for me because my lived experience tells me that sometimes I get weary. It just happens. Sometimes you're weary sort of in a emotional, I didn't get my extra hour of sleep tonight sense. Sometimes you're weary on an emotional soul level, like I keep doing the same things and I don't see change. And it's hard when you feel weary. And then you have the opportunity to do good, and, well, if we're honest, sometimes we just don't want to. Several weeks ago, I had this opportunity to kind of help someone who was in an interesting spot to move into a different location. I was really excited to do it. It was something I wanted to do for this person, and I committed to it a little bit in advance. But by the time the Saturday came around where I was actually going to do this thing, I really hadn't had like a day to myself in like 2 weeks, and I was just tired. And I'm sitting there in bed and complaining to Kristen, like, I've committed to this thing, I don't want to do it, hoping she'd let me off the hook and just say, just stay home, honey, it's fine. She just kicked me out of bed and said, get going. Committed to this thing, go do it. It's like, fine. So I do this thing, and it was just hard. I was just tired. We do lots of service things around here. So many of you know this. We do so many service things. One of the things that we kind of do as a community is La Placentia. On 1 or 2 mornings of La Placentia, I've just woken up and go, okay, here we go. Got to get up early. Got to serve. Got to do good. But I'm tired. And for all of you who faithfully every week serve at our food pantry or work with international students, wherever you do, you probably have had those days where a Wednesday night or a Saturday morning comes around and you know you're doing a good thing, but you're tired. And so I see this and I say, I want to be able to do good without growing weary, and yet my lived experience tells me it is difficult. It's not simple because as humans we have these limitations. And so how do we balance these things? How do we do good but not grow weary? Or is Paul just speaking nonsense? Are we at this place where really what he's trying to tell us, it just can't be done? I think there is a way. I think there's something that Paul specifically had in mind, and it's why he wrote the entire book of Galatians, which is why it's a little unfortunate if you're jumping into our series just today. I need to catch you up, because you have to hear where Paul is coming from, what he's trying to say, because when you understand his message, this idea of not becoming weary and doing good, it actually becomes a promise. So let's do a little bit of a backtrack, all right? So we've had 4 other messages in this series. We're going to quickly summarize all 4 of them. The first one was this. It came from the very first chapter, which basically said there is one gospel and only one gospel. Paul had this problem. He was talking to people who had heard the gospel message, and yet they were being convinced by other groups that there was something else they had to do, other rules they had to follow. In particular, some of the rules that you see in the Old Testament. But for Paul, that was never the point. The one gospel was about Jesus, following Jesus, and he was watching people turn toward this other thing. He said, no, we got to hold on. There's only one gospel, and this matters because every other gospel is going to be insufficient. And so in the next week, we talked about this idea that the rules cannot bring you freedom. The rules do not bring you freedom. And so there were all these rules then that they were trying to follow, that other people had said they had to follow. The very rules that when Jesus showed up on scene, he saw people that he loved trying so hard to be religious, trying to be good, trying to do everything that the Pharisees told them, but they were burnt out because it was too much to follow. Jesus was trying to show them another way, but now all these years later, there are people trying to bring them back, saying, come back and do these rules. Your life will be better if you follow these rules, and it wasn't. Because the rules, even if they're good, they can't bring you freedom. Of course, the opposite is also true, and this is what we talked about in the 3rd week. When you're talking about freedom, you also can't find freedom with the I do what I want mentality. And we saw this at the beginning of chapter 5. Because this was a group of people who used to do what they want. That's what they knew. And they had been called out of that to follow something else. If they slip back into this idea of I do what they want, then what they're going to figure out is this. It may seem like freedom, this idea that no one has any rules for you at all, but it actually becomes a bit of a snare. I mean, think about it in this way. If I live my life by I do what I want, got to look out for number 1. It's kind of about what I get out of life. I'm going to be trapped by a couple things. For one, I'm going to be really annoyed anytime someone doesn't give me what I want. I mean, there's some entitlement inherent in a statement like that. This world is about me getting what I want to get. And so if you're stopping me from getting what I'm going to get mad at you. If there's things that are stopping me from getting what I want and I can't put a face to it, I'm just going to be mad at the world. Because we really can't all get what we want at the end of the day. And sometimes we get exactly what we want and it really didn't put us where we wanted to be anyway. Following just our own best wisdom all the time eventually collapses on itself. And we follow paths that actually bring more destruction than freedom. And so I do what I want, as great as it might sound in our culture, it doesn't bring freedom. And I encourage you to go 2 weeks back to listen to Dan's message to catch more about that. But last week, Dave gave us a way out. The rules don't bring freedom. I do what I want doesn't bring freedom. But life in the Spirit does. And life in the Spirit's just, well, very different. If you're going to follow the Spirit, you're of course not living out of I do what I want, because you've already said, I'm going to do what the Spirit wants me to do. I'm going to follow God in this. I'm going to surrender myself and follow God. But it's also not about rules, because it's not about what everyone else, all the other humans in your life tell you to do. It's about what God is leading you into. And the rules, they tend to fade to the background as the Spirit of God becomes the first thing in your life. Now, of course, the Spirit leads us into good and healthy things, and so sometimes following the rules and following the Spirit, they might look similar at points, but it was never about the rules. It's about following the movement of God in your life. And that's where you get this passage, right? We sometimes call it the fruits of the Spirit passage, and many of you might know the fruits of the Spirit passage, even if you weren't really familiar with the book of Galatians, because it's so familiar to us in our culture. And the fruits of the Spirit, I'm just going to throw them up there. It kind of looks like this. We've got a whole bunch of them, right? Love, joy, peace, forbearance. I like the word forbearance better than patience, which some of you might see in your translations. Forbearance is like, I probably am justified in being mad at you, but I'm going to withhold anyway, right? Kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. When the Spirit has moved in your life, when we're following the Spirit, we become transformed. We become entirely different people, really. That's why you call this fruit, right? You can't actually force these things into your life. You can't go to the grocery store and pick the fruit of love, right? It's not that simple. It's something that gets cultivated in us over time, and that's what the Spirit does. When we're following the Spirit is actually changing our hearts to make us a people who are loving, who are joyful, who are peaceful. That's the effect the Spirit has in transforming us. And I will submit that's going to be just slightly more powerful than 1 extra hour of sleep. And when we're different people, the way that we approach the world is different, right? If 1 extra hour can cause us to be happier with the people that we meet, when our hearts are actually transformed by God, it changes the whole way we approach life. And suddenly, do not become weary in doing good becomes, well, it's a little bit more matter of course. Think of it in this terms. If you're someone who is naturally loving, if your heart has been transformed in a way that you're naturally showing love to the people around you, well, then when you encounter somebody in need in your life, out of that love, you're going to want to meet them where they're at, and if possible, meet their needs. It's just an outpouring of being a loving person. If you're someone who is joyful, well, then when you encounter other people, you're going to want to spread that joy. There's a saying that says, misery loves company. I'm convinced that joy loves company too. When we're a people fully aware of all the good things that God has given us, we just want to spread that around. And when we're living out of joy, we want to bring other people into that joy. When our heart's been transformed to exude peace, then even when situations around us are chaotic and anxieties are high, but our hearts have been transformed by peace, we can bring others into that peace. When we show forbearance, even if somebody does something that is objectively bad, we can decide it's just not that important, at least compared to the kingdom of God. And we can offer grace in that moment. If you're someone who exudes kindness, then everywhere you go, you're going to want to be kind to people. If you're someone who exudes goodness, then when you see an opportunity to do good, you're going to want to do it. If you're someone who is faithful to God and to others, then you're going to stand behind those people who need you most in life. If gentleness is part of who you are, then even when people are being a little bit abrasive, you're going to show up and say, but the Spirit of God can do so much more in your life. And if we have self-control, we can get away from the I do what I want mentality and take a step back and see the big picture of how the Spirit of God is moving in our lives, in our community, we're going to see what God is up to. We're going to see it's better than whatever we had in mind, and we're going to want to jump in. And because our hearts have been transformed now, this whole idea of not being weary while doing good, it totally makes sense. It's there because our posture's changed. The way we approach the world has changed. The way we approach the people around us is different now. And so we show up and we say, I'm here to do good because that's what I love to do. Because my heart is different. And that's why you find freedom in following the Spirit, because it's only when the Spirit transforms our heart that any of that actually seems appetizing. In the I do what I want mentality, these fruit actually don't sound all that great most of the time. They don't necessarily give us what we want. But when God has transformed our hearts and our priorities and the lens with which we view the world, we say, I'm all in, and it's awesome that I get to be part of this. And we're free to be who we were made to be. And all that is much better than one extra hour of sleep. Now, it's possible at this point that you might say to yourself, I'm being a little optimistic, and that's fair, right? It's not very often that we wake up in the morning and feel all of this, typically. We don't usually feel the fruit of the Spirit in that regard. And this is a valid point. And I think this is why Paul structures chapter 6 the way that he does. And so this is why this is going to be the last section of Scripture that we're going to go through in this series. And so I want you to take a look at chapter 6, verse 1. There are three things I think that Paul tries to remind us about to help us with this idea of not growing weary and doing good. Three things he's going to set up front before he gets there that will help us. Now, I didn't actually put these main points on the screen, so if you're a note taker, I'm just going to kind of say it and you can write it out there. But here's the first thing that we need to catch from Galatians chapter 6. The first thing that we need to know is that when it comes to life in the Spirit, to following the Spirit, we have to help each other. We have to help each other. Which is why we've all gathered in rooms like this today, while throughout the rest of the week we depend on each other. Here's what it says. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something they are not, they deceive themselves. So I think the first thing that Paul recognizes is we are actually going to mess it up. It's going to happen. We're not always going to exude love, joy, peace, forbearance in our lives. It's just not always going to occur. And even more than that, it's not necessarily going to occur with your neighbor. And that can be frustrating. But if we're following the Spirit then, when we see someone who's living out of the fruit of the Spirit, out of what God intended for them, we have the opportunity to say, hey, I don't think that's who you really want to be. Do you have any friendships like that? People who are good enough friends that they're not going to tell you what you want to hear, they're going to tell you what you need to hear. You're going to say, that's not you. You're tired today. That's not the love that you want to show. And we can very gently restore each other to the place where we're living this life guided by the Spirit. Now, we have to be careful because sometimes you actually get in that vicious cycle, the misery loves company kind of thing. And so if you have your neighbor who's kind of having a bad day and you kind of let them drag you down, you can have this cycle where like the world is against you, and that's no good. And so we have to continue, even when the people around us are having a hard time, to lean on the Spirit and ask the Spirit to restore that situation. We have to be aware that we need that help. Sometimes we think we're something different than we are. We're good. We don't need anything else. We don't need the help of the people around us. Shoot, we're not even sure if we need the help of the Spirit anymore. And once we get to that point, where we've deceived ourselves into thinking we're like better than we are, we basically have thrown up our hands and said, I don't care about being transformed anymore. The moment you say, I don't need any help, you are saying, I don't need to be transformed. I'm good. Right where I'm at. But life in the Spirit means constantly being transformed, constantly seeing what God has next for you. So we have to help each other, and that brings us into this next idea, which is we need to celebrate when progress occurs. Look at verse 4. Each one of you should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone, without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. Nevertheless, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. All right. So one of the things that I've discovered in talking with people sometimes is as they want to grow closer to God, they have that what I call I'm not Mother Teresa syndrome. The idea here is that I'm going to hold up someone who was like at the end of their spiritual journey and we've kind of like idolized over here and say, I'm not as good as X person, so I'm not really going to participate. I'm going to let X person who's better than me be the one who kind of participates in life with the Spirit and doing good. When we get to that point, when we're comparing ourselves to others, comparing ourselves to other Christians who are maybe further down the road or better at some of the fruit than I am, then at some point in time, it actually becomes demoralizing, and we fail to see the good the Spirit of God is doing in our lives because we're comparing ourselves to someone else who's on some other journey, and it stifles us. The whole point was to never compare ourselves to other people. It's very similar to, and this is important for me, it's very similar to going to the gym. If I go to the gym and compare myself to the average male who's in the gym, I'm going to be pretty disheartened, right? Like there's people in there who just have bulging muscles like this. And so if I'm evaluating my progress in the gym based on the person that I'm trying to pump iron next to, it's not going to go well. It just doesn't. But any trainer will tell you that's never the point. You're not supposed to go to the gym to compare yourself to the buff guy 2 machines down. You're supposed to go to the gym to increase your own health. And the progress is measured not by how close am I to this guy, but how far I am now from where I was 2 weeks ago. And that's spiritual growth. We're probably, the more we do life with the Spirit, we're probably going to be more aware of all the ways that we have yet to grow. God's Spirit seems to do that in our lives. He shows us the ways in which we still have places to head in our relationship with Him. And that's good. That's because growth is important. But we measure our progress by where we were 2 weeks ago. Did we move with God since then? Did we listen to the Spirit and hear what step God wanted us to take? It's probably not going to be everything all at once, but did we take that one step with God? And have we moved along? And if we do this, then it's really important that we celebrate it. That's why I think he says this, that the one who receives instruction in the Word should share all good things with their instructor. We need to be joyous about the progress that God is making in our own lives. When the Spirit of God is actually moving us, actually transforming our hearts, and we actually see that we're more naturally loving and joyful and peaceful, we got to celebrate that. And bring in the other people who are on this journey with us and say, I'm making progress. I got a long way to go, sure, but I'm making progress. And when we celebrate the way that God is working in our life, then we see just how powerful God's Spirit is because we're not today where we were 2 weeks ago. And that makes a big difference. And the last thing that Paul wants us to remember before we get to this whole idea of doing good is that we have to make time ultimately for the Spirit in our life. We have to make Him a priority. We have to say we're actually going to commit to following Him. And so this is what verse 7 says. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. And we talked about this last week. This idea of the flesh is sort of this idea of, really, it's the I do what I want kind of life. I follow sort of my base impulses, the things that seem good to me but might be outside the kingdom of God. If that's our focus, then that's where we're going to grow. We've talked about this idea. You're going to grow somewhere. It's just a matter of where. And so if I'm going to grow in my pursuit of comfort, for instance, we'll go that direction. But it might be outside of what God is looking for us to do. But if we move with the Spirit, then that's where they grow. Okay, so I was a junior high pastor for a really long time. So one of the things I love to do every summer, I still miss it when the junior hires and the high schoolers go off to summer camp, is take them to this camp. And we've been to different camps, different events. It doesn't really matter where we go or what the program is. The same thing always happens. Students show up. They tend to have an amazing encounter with God. They're super excited about it. They're like, my whole life is different now. They get down the mountain, and a week later, they're like, everything's the same. Sometimes we call it the camp high and the coming off the mountain thing. And so then we have this conversation, right? Here's the question. Why was it that I felt so close to God up at summer camp for a week, and then I come back home and everything seems kind of the same? Not very much has changed. And the answer, I think, is actually really simple. It really doesn't seem to matter where we are, what we've done. The difference is that during that week, we've set aside time for the Spirit to do something in our lives. And more than that, we actually expected that the Spirit would. And look, I can't promise anything, right? We can't control the Spirit. We can't control how the Spirit works. But generally speaking, I see this time and time again, when we give the Spirit space to work in our lives and we expect Him to do that, the Spirit moves. When we don't, and this is what a lot of my junior hires and high schoolers would experience, we get back to the regular routine of life, and school comes up, and now homework is crunched every aspect of our lives, and we sort of forget about this relationship that we had with God because it just gets pushed to the side. Well, it can't be terribly surprising then when it feels like our spiritual life is being strangled either. And so somehow, in the flow of our lives, we have to allow for the Spirit of God to move, which might mean having to reorganize our schedules and our priorities to allow for the Spirit of God to be the first thing. It's not easy in this culture, right? I've been talking with junior high and high school again, right? You've got everybody claiming that they're your biggest priority. Your history teacher claims that that history test is the most important thing to you that day, right? Your sports coach will say that your sport is the most important thing to you for this year. And this is all around us when we've entered the workforce, when we have families, good things, but things that could be all-consuming. And we've stopped listening for the voice of God in our lives. We've stopped following life in the Spirit. It can be constricting. But when we make space for God, when we have an expectation for Him to move, He just tends to move. And we find ourselves growing in that direction. And we get to celebrate the progress like we just saw in a couple verses ago. So Paul knows all of these things. He knows we need to help each other, to carry each other's burdens. He knows we need to celebrate the progress that we're making. And he knows that we need to allow the Spirit to have priority in our lives. At one point, we almost titled this entire series, Slow Growth. Because if you look at the book of Galatians, that's kind of what you see. It's an agricultural metaphor. The fruit doesn't show up overnight. The growth takes time, and it takes steps, and it takes movement, but it's there. And suddenly we can look back on our past selves, and say, I'm not the same person I was back then. My heart has actually been changed. And so when we go back to this verse 9 and 10, and it says, let's not become weary in doing good, that becomes our default posture. And as we have every opportunity, let's do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. We're going to want to do it. Now, it's important that we not fall back into a rules thing. And so this is where that balance comes in. We have to allow God's Spirit to move us. And so we ask God, where do you want me to show up for people? Who is it that you want me to invest in? And if you have other people in your life saying where you should spend your time, that might be good advice, but consult the Spirit on that. Because if you listen to every person in your life about how you should spend all of your time, you're going to need 72-hour days to get it done. And then you're going to be weary all over again. But if it's the Spirit that's moving us to do good, Spirit will point us in the right direction. And as our heart is transformed, well, life, it just becomes different. I want to invite Jared back up to the stage. As he does, I want to look at just one more verse in the book of Galatians. It's not quite the last verse, but I think that this is sort of the hinge point. This is what Paul really wants to say. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, the ways that you showed your commitment to the rules. The rules, they don't mean anything. What counts is the new creation. And that's what we want to be. We want to be a new creation, and that's what the Spirit of God does in our hearts, in our lives, and it's there that we find freedom. It's there that we find rest that supersedes anything you're going to get on a daylight savings time day. It's a freedom to be able to actually do good to others without reservation. It's a freedom to be able to see what God is up to, and it's a freedom to be a part of that. So may we be a people who live life in the Spirit. God, today we do not want to grow weary in doing good. We want to follow you in all that we do. God, I pray that you would help us to lift each other's burdens in that process, that we'd celebrate the progress we make, and that, God, we would focus on your Spirit because we want to be a new creation, doing good because you've changed our hearts, because you loved us and you love this world, and we want to join you in the love that you're pouring out on every person.